Hello, my name is Jevan Watkins Jones and I'm an artist and a gardener. And because of this dual occupation, I have a natural and particular interest in landscape and the ways in which we see and experience landscape through our creative interactions with it. But this film is not about the landscape in general, it's about the singular and special landscape of the Stour Valley. And some of the artists, both past and present, who have been inspired by its vistas, touched by its historical reaches, and shaped by their childhood memories of it. We also hear from local museum directors, custodians of significant collections of work by Constable, Gainsborough and Munnings. A new chapter in the story of Benton End, former home of Cedric Morris and Let Haynes, and the East Anglian School of Painting and Drawing, as well as from North House Gallery on the banks at the mouth of the River Stur, and from an artist-run project space that encourages a fluid discourse between historic art and contemporary art practices. All of these recollections form circles within circles that stir our visual consciousness surrounding the Stur and its long-held presence in the story of art.
Constable is so great is that you can sort of smell the Suffolk, you could feel your feet going down into the Suffolk mud in a Constable. You could feel the flank of a horse when he painted a horse. You can feel the charge of a river. You can feel the dome of the sky, of course. And it's the way Constable can do what one does try in one's own way to do is to make the paint the thing that he's painting. You know, he builds a tree, he builds a river, he builds a horse with this. I love, of course, the physicality of Constables.
Munnings was born at the top of Suffolk in the Waveney Valley. He certainly made a decision to buy Castle House here in the Stour Valley because of its proximity to the river and the East Anglian landscape that he could see around him. And indeed he called this house the house of his dreams because it was so close to the river and also so close to Constable Flatford, who was Constable being an artist that he admired greatly. And so I don't know whether it's just sheer luck that happened. But clearly the landscape here did have an influence on some of the greatest artists that Britain has ever known.
I wonder whether it's just the huge coincidence of Gainsborough and Constable being born within, I don't know, was it 10 miles of each other? Within sort of a generation apart. I mean, what are the chances of that? And then the landscape that they were born into kind of corresponded to Dutch landscape painting. And so you've got this kind of, it's almost this scenario being set up somehow that enables the idea of the English landscape to be born from these two artists in this particular location.
I think that history of Gainsborough and Constable is super important to the area, and you go to various museums and galleries across Suffolk and they crop up everywhere, and their importance, I think, resonates in the contemporary world.
And what I kept finding was lots of sweaters that had landscape images on them, particularly these kind of idealised country cottage, rolling hills kind of images. And I became kind of fascinated with that and started buying them. And initially I was wearing them, and then I thought there was maybe a way I could link these kind of ideas together and these desires together.
The landscape outside is what I walk in, what I draw, what I sort of experience. In the studio, the landscape becomes the drawings. You're excavating the drawings as a landscape. You see, when you paint, I'm not sure that you necessarily know all of this. You just do it and forget all the stuff which you say.
Again, it's that searching for a motif in a way. It's just sort of, so I would go out and look for something to draw, and that becomes boring, difficult, because you go somewhere and you think, well, I've been here, I've done that, I've done that, I've done this, I've done that.
Well, the start of it's kind of like anyone will tell you if you're kind of like stuck for an idea or need to think, like going for a walk somewhere, especially in the landscape, is a good way of thinking. People say it's to do with the rhythm of you walking and having the horizon to look at somehow sort of empties the mind, doesn't it? And I think when you start to key into those elements of the romance, that sort of sense of you. When you can see the horizon, it's like you suddenly get a sense of you on the planet, you in the landscape, and you're not just sort of like somebody else in a little town somewhere, and it kind of makes you, I secretly think it makes you feel a bit important.
I work using canvas, and so I make my marks with my hands, with sticks, with charcoal, anything. So my whole body's involved.
So I think it's taking all those things you see, the experiences you have outside, the sort of the temperature, the lights, the birds that you see or who you meet out there, all of those experiences you have, which you're kind of notating in drawing, it doesn't become pictured in the studio, it becomes turned into paint.
My mother paid for me to go and stay with Yvonne Drury for a week in the holidays to learn about oil paints. And she wandered across this field at Curtin to see what I was doing. And insects were everywhere. Insects were sticking to painting. Insects were sticking to the canvas. They were sticking to brushes, sticking to rags. Insects. So I said, well, what do I do about it? She said, well, there's only one thing to do, have a cigarette. So from the moment oil paint was in my hands, so was a cigarette.
My parents, I now realise, had a reproduction of Willie Lott's cottage. I remember looking at it as a child a lot, seeing this house, because I thought it was the house where we lived. I never asked them, was it? But I always thought, that's our house, a picture of our house up there, because it's right on the water, isn't it? And it's just like ours was.
So we have two pictures that really look at that iconic view of Flatford and Willie Lott's house, which most people will be familiar with. We have a smaller oil sketch of Willie Lott's house, which again is quite loosely oil, painted. It gives you an insight into how he would work outside, recording the landscape. And then we have a much more worked up finished piece called The Millstream, which a few years ago we actually had cleaned, and we were able to discover a little kingfisher just hovering above the water, which has this kind of iconic flash of red that people know from Constable to draw your eye in.
Well, as I said, my mother used to take me to Flatford, and she always pointed out the wrong cottage for Willie Lott's cottage. She always pointed to the wrong cottage and said, that is Willie Lott's cottage. It wasn't. It doesn't seem to have had any bad effect on me, really.
But Constable's a very different kind of artist to Gainsborough. But, he talks about Gainsborough. Luckily, he leaves quite a lot of writing about Gainsborough and the influence he had. And what did he say? About particulars Gainsborough had nothing to do with. He wasn't about that. He was about it was about sensation. And he talks about the emotion of Gainsborough's landscapes too. So we know that Constable was hugely inspired by him.
The paintings are a response to Gainsborough and Constable, classic Suffolk painters, very kind of important historical figures. The picturesque landscape of Suffolk and the sort of geological kind of landscape in which the work is based and formed from. The paintings are kind of precise copies of the originals. This is called a stream and weir, and Alex has kind of painted an inverted version of that.
I think all my subjects it's about that edge between land and water. So it's the coast, the rivers, the marshes, sort of all of those, that interaction between what you know and maybe what you don't know, that sort of boundary. And it is a very fluid boundary. A lot of as you get further down the into the sort of estuary landscape, it's a tidal landscape. So there's constant flux of, there's constant movement, and everything is responding to it. So the kind of light, the movement of the birds, the sort of the landscape that you actually see is always in response to this movement in the landscape.
So there's this moment when you're driving along and you turn around this bit of road, and then the river, the Stour's there. And every time I drive around that bend, it's like this fantastic, every cell in my body releases. And it's it's like being like nowhere else. And it just happens every time.
The idea for the series, Someone Else's Dream, came kind of from lots of different directions. On one hand, I'd moved from London to the countryside, and I wanted to make work that kind of reflected that or grounded me in the environment I was in. And one of the sweaters has a body drowned in a river, and it had 2 small stitches of red on it to mimic blood, and someone stole the blood. So during the duration of the exhibition, someone unpicked the red wool. So that's I like that reaction. I like the way there was a kind of crime against the criminal image.
And so the real fashionable portraits of the time were called pictures in little in the 18th century, known now really as conversation pieces. And they're full size, or full length, but not full size, small scaled figures in a landscape. So it's all about the landscape and figure together. So, you know, that relationship, in a way what happened, you had that initially, then there becomes a dichotomy between portraiture on one side, landscape on the other, very clearly.
I suppose I was researching these stories of things that happen in the countryside that aren't quite so idyllic. So, for example, car crashes. There are masses of car crashes on country roads. People are crashing into everything all the time. So I made this piece of work long before I moved to the countryside, and was witnessed so many car crashes, as it were. But I've always been really drawn to very human expressions. So, like this piece represents a memorial on a tree, obviously for someone that's crashed into the tree. And those memorials are often what some people might call trashy, or they kind of have quite a lot of kind of plastic or cheap items associated with them, or they might have, like, quite often you'll see them when young men have crashed, and then maybe like football shirts or scarves tied around trees or whatever someone's crashed into. And I've always enjoyed is not quite the right word, because of course it's desperately sad, but I suppose I've always liked to see that person has been remembered and that person means something. But I really enjoy that, using the things as supposedly valueless to memorialise something as valuable as a human life is to those individuals that have lost that human.
There's a release from the constraints of the commissions, you know, where you have to paint the likeness of a person and a likeness of their horse, and then their house in the background and their, you know, hands in front of them. He would be painting landscape. It was his release, up and down the river Stur, views of deep mill ponds and you know, frozen winter rivers, and the landscapes in which the river sits, and people enjoying the river, for example, in pictures like September Afternoon, where you've got 2 lovely ladies gliding down the river in a canoe with a parasol, and there's beautiful light. And we realised the extent of the river scenes that we had within the collection. Over 75 works which just featured almost the River Stour itself, whether it be at Flatford Dedham, further up at Langham. He would bring his friends from London and they would canoe up and down the river. We have wonderful photographs of him and his wife Violet swimming in the river and paddling.
You're in this little electric boat, which is quiet as can be, and you would right down on the river. You're sitting below the water level, if you see what I mean. And so your view is almost water level. So you see voles and kingfishers and cows looking at you from above. Drift along really quiet. It's fantastic.
And we'd swim in the freezing water at Flatford, you know, falling out of the boat and somehow getting back in again. And water's inside all of us, and I think very clearly, I mean, Suffolk is on the coast and it has many rivers. I think about 18 rivers or something flow through Suffolk. And so water is part of this whole life.
Water comes in and it goes out twice a day, so it's kind of quite hopeful as it comes in and slightly more depressing when it goes out. But it's always, always different, and the weather's always different. And we used to, on a nice day, we used to come home from school and just run over the road and straight in the river. if the time is up, obviously. But, so yeah, it's a huge, huge part.
It's lovely when you're sort of, there are groups of you going in and everyone's having that experience. I mean, people are coming to the river to heal. Whether they're not always conscious of it, but they come here to feel better. They come to release themselves from their job they've done. Some people come here after work. Some people are coming for the weekend. They're coming, you know, some people aren't well, they're coming, they're grieving. People are coming to the river for all sorts of reasons, to be nurtured.
My favourite time is May, June, 4 o'clock in the morning. The river looks amazing and not something I could ever give up.
Well, it's a wonderful feeling. It's a wonderful, wonderful feeling. It's a sort of getting in, and sometimes she's cold, sometimes she's quite unexpectedly warm. You know, in August it can be quite warm. And then it's once I've made that plunge and the water goes over my shoulders and this wonderful release.
But part of it is the way the water kind of draws the landscape, I think. There's a sort of a force, a fluid force that's moving in and around the landscape, which is like drawing and redrawing the landscape.
Essentially, landscape was the important element I didn't think people got when they sort of looked at, for example, a hovercraft made of plastic bottles just sitting on the floor of an art gallery. So I thought, we'll bring the landscape in a very literal sense into the art gallery with this vehicle. And oddly enough, when I bought all these landscape paintings, like I said, from about, I don't know, maybe 6 different car boot sales in an area. I used to go about 6 different car boot sales every weekend, and I bought them all for about maybe 50 pence or £1 each from different stores. And when I got to the amount I needed, so it was about 70, I remember this guy saying, "Oh, that'll be £5." And I thought, well, that's very steep. And the guy said, "People collect those, you know." And of course I realised it wasn't people, it was me. I managed to put the price of these Constable prints up all on my own.
Was it Andrew Graham Dixon pointed out that Constable country isn't the geography, it's the surface of the painting. And so it's the fact, it wasn't always there. We see that landscape through artists' eyes. We understand it more and better through the eyes of those artists. It didn't always exist looking like that, and it was just waiting for someone clever to come along and put it on canvas. They actually invented how we see the landscape. And so you can also reinvent how you see the landscape. So as we move forward, as we keep thinking about these things and move forward, we're reinventing the landscape. So how we see the Stour Valley, we kind of still see it through the eyes of Constable. But we didn't always see it like that. We see it like that because he painted it like that.
He feels quite detached from it in some respects. So there's that element of being sort of detached from the landscape that you're within that I think is also kind of current in the work.
I am coming from very far away, and a painting is already an image of distance, especially in particular landscape painting. You are depicting the distance between the painter and the subject, which is the land. So the distance is already within the image. So I wanted to take these historical works, these kind of frozen images, which have become so famous and so valued, and to really create a painting based on this idea of what the eye is doing.
The process of painting, this stuff on the surface. It's mud, isn't it? It's the stuff of the estuary and the riverbanks, and it's fluid and it's moving around on the surface, and it's quite exciting, sort of just seeing what happens as this process develops. But at some point, the process stops and this stuff solidifies on the surface.
I was invited to make work for a show, and I wanted to develop this process of monoprinting onto canvas, where I work on any scale. And we'd moved into town by then, but I remembered very strongly the wood that we lived in. And it was a beautiful wood that you walk through to get to the river. And there was something magical about that walk and going through the woods, and the quality of light and the sort of release from what's going on in one's mind. And then arriving at the river and it being this wonderful thing, this release.
I don't draw what I can see. I draw what I saw. So I have a bit of time to think about it, even if it's only the walk from there back to here. And it's so you can sort things out, you know. You don't look at the leaves and the trees, and you know, you just take it on board. What's important, filter it. Graham Sutherland said he went out and found an image that was concrete and came back to his studio and made it more concrete.
When I was drawing at Flatford, one of the things you notice is, how the water breaks up what you're seeing above the water. So in a sense, you're seeing the same thing twice, but it's broken into the water. So there was a language, I think, of dashes and horizontal little marks which started to appear in the water. I thought, actually, I can move them up into the trees. And I think then I could see those willows in a linear kind of way. So you start to draw these marks which run up the bark, which are sort of parallel marks, or the way where it's been pollarded, all that growth then explodes out of those cuts in the wood. I did 1 or 2 drawings of the cattle, but they're never where you want them to be.
We as humans approach the landscape in different ways. For rest and recreation, in love, loss and labour, we identify with it, finding our own place amongst the green. A plant physiologist once told me, of course plants have no use for green, a statement that opened my eyes and caused me to change my whole view of green. Plants live by means of red and blue light and rebound green, a byproduct for the benefits of humans and other living organisms. Green is vital, something we yearn for, yet it's often elusive to the artist.
The colour green is very important to me in those prints. I'm working with this particular green that I make myself. I love looking at all the different oak trees. They all grow slightly differently because they're affected by the salt in the air. And then the green in the salt marshes and the moss and the samphire and the sea purslane. I'm looking at the green all the time. It feeds me.
I hear that we can distinguish more shades of green than we can of any other colour. So I guess it is more difficult. I have kind of avoided it and gone round it to a certain extent because the marshes, the river, the estuary, in a sense, there's large areas of it which you can avoid the colour green altogether.
I grew up in the middle of London. Green was something that I looked for. I went to a school close to Brixton and there was one tree in the playground. That was the green. And I used to go around collecting moss out of the cracks in the concrete.
Munnings' use of green is apparent in lots of ways, a myriad of ways in his painting. An early picture like Horse Fair at Lavenham, he was always unhappy with the shade of the green that he'd used for the grass that fills up most of the picture. And he had worked up this large oil painting from a small watercolour. Whether it didn't translate well enough. It was his first large major canvas, and in fact his unhappiness with it was further backed up by the Royal Academy skying it at the Royal Academy Summer Show, so hanging it up high so that it wasn't in the main public eye line.
It's very different if you grow up in one's relationship with nature, if you grow up in the city or if you grow up in the country. And I'm very aware of having moved to the country as an adult that I will never have that very deep connection that I see some other people have with nature. It's in you in a different way. I feel like an outsider getting to know it all the time, exploring, finding my way with it.
And it was summer and it was all green. And I said to someone I was called the Brigadier, Penny Coleman, who owned the house, Penny Allen. I said, I can't stand green. I looked at all this green, I can't stand green. And so she said, well, just get up a bit blinking earlier in the morning. So I started to get up at about, it was July, so about 4 o'clock in the morning. And there stretched the Orwell with me on this edge of it, and above, from the horizon, the other side, the land, the other side of the Orwell, there was the sunrise. Absolutely fantastic. I mean, when I started to paint the sunrise, people said, oh, you should go to India or something. I mean, what's the point? It's all absolutely here in Suffolk.
I'm looking for the green light. The green light to be in, that's where I think about the viewer.
And when I think of Constable, I don't know, green is not the colour that comes to mind. Light and dark, the drama comes to mind, you know, the drama of the Suffolk sky and the way it affects the land.
I like the whole idea of the artist garden. There's quite a lot of artists who were gardeners. You look in the Stour Valley, you've got John Nash, you've got Cedric Morris, who are obviously, I think they would have called themselves artist gardeners or artist plantsmen. Peter Coker, who painted his garden late in life, sort of at Missley. And I like that idea of maybe there's some role for the garden in an artist's kind of life. I don't exactly know what it is. It's something to do with letting nature loose in a space that you've got control over.
I see that I have a garden inside me, and that it's forever growing. She's forever growing. What comes out in my work are invented gardens.
So the two most significant paintings here in Ipswich are the Flower and Kitchen Garden by Constable, and they're quite small scale really, and they were painted in 1815, and they're views directly from the house that Constable was born in, East Bergholt House, that his father had built. So they're views from an upper floor window looking out across the fields to the sort of ornamental flower garden, and then the very much more industrial kitchen garden where the vegetables are being grown, and there's a gardener working out in the landscape. And they're seen as very personal pieces for Constable. I mean, he classically said that, you know, painting is another word for feeling. So for him, it is all loaded with emotion. And in 1815, his mother had actually collapsed in the flower garden, and then shortly after had died. So he sort of knew that his childhood landscape was going to change, and this was a moment that he could kind of capture that through painting. And those two paintings never were sold, you know, they weren't for a commission for anything. They were kept in his studio, and they were found there, you know, after he died in 1837.
Every morning I'm up the garden, turn round and there's the wood. Day after day, 3 times a day perhaps. That's 1,000 times in a year. You see it. Different seasons, different times of the day, different weather, different emotional feelings towards me, all of that, all contained within just that one little shape. So that's become what I do. So I come to the studio, I don't have to worry about where am I going to go and draw today, what's my subject today, it's all there.
In the summer you can't see the shape of trees, can you? I much prefer looking at trees in the winter where you can really see the shape of them. I think Constable marvellously managed that movement. You know, he very often painted the native Suffolk black poplar because of that twinkling movement of the leaves in any kind of breeze.
You get a road and you get an oak tree that overhangs it, and you get another oak tree further up the road that overhangs it, and you think there's a tunnel there. But when you drive along, you go past one tree, and there isn't a tunnel. It's not a tunnel. But when you get to there and you turn around and look back, there is a tunnel. So that's that illusion again of wanting to go to it. But it isn't there. It's only there from here or from up there.
With a landscape that's sort of a river landscape or an estuary landscape, there's a lot of light being reflected the whole time. So there's not a huge amount of shadow, and it's quite high key all the time. Even late into the evening, there's a lot of light reflecting off the ground. So that's one issue, that it's not a landscape of dark, deep shadows, and it's a very high key landscape.
As a child, I didn't understand why this leafy, tiny little brook turned into this great river that we've got here. And Stur means great river. This is a great river. So only walking it did I understand it. But people love the light of it, which comes off the river. Well, East Anglian skies it's a cliche thing to say, but it is important. The light is so clear and different, and it doesn't rain that much, so you can get out and do stuff. I mean, it's not the same as your Mediterranean light, for example. It's quite cold in a way, but there it is. You've always got a huge dome of sky over you.
The light, the clouds, Constable's clouds. I mean,
Clouds feature such a lot, and clouds are so... We don't understand them, you know. They didn't understand them in the past. They were sort of magic.
I think the relation to Constable as well is that he had this almost... I mean, it is a scientific understanding of clouds in an age where the word scientist wasn't, what hadn't come into existence. But so he had this sort of analytical way of looking at clouds and trying to understand what they were about. And I think I don't look at them like that, but they're just extraordinary forms. And you get this sense of there being a vast space out there which we don't usually register, which is full of stuff hanging above the landscape.
So I used to go and stand out there and look up and look straight up, not that or this, but straight up. And I've never really done that since I was a child, laying on my back, in love with somebody. When you're about 12, you think, the world's going to end if you don't marry them, all that sort of stuff. So it all became quite an emotional thing,
What is it about them? It's about they're an unbounded form in a similar way to, I guess, the water sort of moves around under its own energy in relation to the land. The clouds form and disperse in this sort of empty space above the land.
So I think, well, how on earth do you draw clouds? How do you draw? You can't use a line because there aren't any lines. So it became an interesting problem. But I have to go out and look and run in and do it because they do move so quickly. I mean, when they look at their best, it doesn't last long. Even if there's no wind, it's still a movement to it. And then I go and look at my wood, and there's often a cloud above it in exactly the same shape as the wood. And I'm sure there's a relationship between... But there can't be, because those clouds above the wood are miles away. But there does often, so often, I look at my wood and there's a cloud above it, exactly the same shape. Intriguing. I haven't solved it yet. I don't suppose I will, but...
A very important thing that Jevan Watkins said to me was that the artist doesn't choose the subject chooses the artist. And I try to be a channel for that subject to come through me and into the piece of work. That is crucially important.
I guess the subject matter I use is quite limited, but then I think I haven't anywhere near got to the bottom of the subject matter I'm using, so why would you move on?
Yes, I went to Benton End in 1960 when my parents needed some kind... I decided that I wanted to try to be an artist, and my parents needed some kind of encouragement, so I said, very well, I will go and show my work to Cedric Morris, Benton End being on the outskirts of Hadley, and notorious for every vice under the sun. I mean, quite appealing at the age of 15. And that is, so I was 15, it was a summer evening, and I banged on the door, and Let came to the door. He was very tall, I suppose rather frightening, and I said, is Sir Cedric Morris at home, please? And he said, Cedric Morris is having his dinner. So I said, well, may I wait, please? And so Let said, well, I suppose you'd better come in. So I went in. And Cedric was sitting at the end of a long refectory table, and Let was bringing him extraordinary dish after extraordinary dish. I mean, who'd heard of couscous in 1960, you know? He was a fantastic cook. And anyway, Cedric was very welcoming. He was very chatty and giggly and funny, and I sat while he ate this meal, this dinner, and then he said, well, put the paintings up at the end there on the storage heater thing. And he was very encouraging, but made certain criticisms, and then Let wandered back into the room. And he was very encouraging, but made the opposite criticisms of Cedric. Anyway, I was by now about 10 or half past, and my mother thought that I'd been sold into the white slave trade, at least by now. But anyway, as I left, Let said, well, I suppose you're still at school? And I said, yes. He said, well, come and paint in the holidays. And so the first day of the holidays I was there, but I was too shy to go up the drive into the house, and I sat in the ditch at the end of the drive and painted the ditch. And then a painter who lived in Lamb called Lucy Harwood sort of staggered out from the house down the drive bringing an enormous cowbell, and I went in, and that's really where life began, and I worked with Let in the kitchen, and that's when Let said the most important thing anyone's ever said to me, that if I was going to be an artist, I had to make my work my best friend, that I could go to it whatever I was feeling, you know, miserable, happy, bored, sad, randy, desperate, whatever I was feeling, I could go to my work and have a conversation with it, and that's how I've lived my life. I mean, they both believe passionately in drawing, and but I realised pretty early on that you tended to be a Let person or a Cedric person, and the Cedric people seemed to me to be trying to paint like Cedric. I didn't see the point of that. Whereas Let had that magical thing as a teacher to sort of bring out whoever you were. He would address each person as someone completely new and different, which we are, and bring out who you were.
That's why art school was fantastic, because you're not only taught to draw, the music you hear. The first day I walked into Colchester Art School, heard Take 5 for Dave Brubeck, just blew me off. What the hell was that, you know? And then going to visit the teachers often. They invite you to their homes, and they were bohemians, you know, and they had proper pasta, garlic and things that we didn't have in our home. So it was a complete education. So much in the world that I didn't know about. Coming from small town Sudbury, you know, art education is just wonderful.
I grew up around this area. My parents' house where I grew up is 2 minutes walk from the house I live in now. So I've known the landscape for all my life. And so I think partly what I used to think I was doing, it's something about that continuity in the landscape. But I think gradually you think, well, I know this landscape. I'm not bound by the topography of it, and I don't feel too in awe of it. I think I can use it for what I want to do. And so I think it's just that I'm very familiar with it, and you feel that you're not on the surface, you're not dealing with the surface anymore, you're dealing with some kind of depth in it, you're swimming in the landscape.
I fell in love with it immediately, and it was a shocking thing. It was a very shocking thing to fall in love with a landscape that I didn't know, that I didn't have any ancestral, any familial roots to. I didn't think that was a thing that could happen.
Make the most of where you are. Don't keep worrying about over there and over there, because it isn't there.
And I've still got stories I want to stitch, but I haven't got sweaters to stitch them into.
Dad was Polish, so he came to England after the war. But basically when the war finished in Italy, they were given a choice of countries to resettle in. And my dad picked Canada, missed the boat for Canada, and ended up in England's second choice, yeah? But he then described his first impression of England, right? He said, we had to march from station to transit camp. As we marched through narrow country roads, thick green hedges, green trees, growing so thick they meet in the middle. We were marching through a green tunnel. Then there was a gap in the hedge, and we had our first view over a field of beautiful, ripe, golden corn. The sun was shining. Christopher, you know, what a beautiful country we had come to. And you know, fucking rained ever since.
Well, it's a wonderful space, isn't there? That whole Flatford, Dedham, East Burgold, that whole Constable country is in it. I just hope to God that it is there for people's grandchildren's grandchildren's grandchildren, and not built on in any kind of way, because it is an idyll.